Thank you very much, Professor Sardar. It's really very enlightening, mentioning about the nature of the holy text in terms of being argumentative, being a continuous, complete, giving you the complete freedom, and also leaving you without answers. So, quoting the Holy Qur'an is not a fixed feast in history. I would like to have two very brief comments before we open the floor for questions and answers from the audience. I recall very vividly in one of your publications you mentioned that there is only one possible relationship or possible way of relationship between the believer and the Quran, and that is the interpretative relationship. So maybe you can tell us more about that in the light of the organic and interactive view or approach of the text itself. The interpretative relationship between the reader and the text. So there is no other way. You cannot go above that. All text, can get it.
Excuse me. With any text, right? You can only have an interpretative relationship, but and more specifically with the sacred text, I think that is all you can have.
That's not the way that many of us are.
No. You see, many of us think that it's a too holy a text. It requires us to be complete and an expert in it for us to actually engage with it. I'm a medical doctor. I'm an engineer. I'm a social scientist. What do I know about this? Right? In a sense. These are genuine fears. This is why I started off by saying that when I was asked to do these are the obvious questions that concerns that come to your mind. But then what happens to your own beliefs and your own conscience? In a sense, if, for example, you believe that we Muslims have a moral high ground, and everybody who is not a Muslim is definitely by definition kafir, and therefore inferior to us. Right? Now that's a very poisonous belief, and many Muslims believe that. How have you acquired this belief? Because you've been told to believe this, not because you have engaged with the text. So I think if you believe that, now if you've engaged with the text and then came up with that belief, I think that's one thing. Okay. But if you come up with that belief without actually engaging with the text, because somebody else told you that, or you read a classical book or whatever, then I don't think that God will judge you accordingly.
Well, if you engage with the text as a reader, as a believer, I think the only answer or conclusion you have is that you are actually in a much more precarious place than the kafir is. Because you have the responsibility to understand and to spread the message, which we are not doing anyway. So in some way, we don't know who is tested more. Is it believers or is it unbelievers?
I agree with that.
And how would you relate all of this to Eco's concept of open text, whereby he gives the agency to the reader and he gives the... I think it's pretty similar in that sense.
Well, it's not... as I said, it's an argumentative text. It's a evolutionary text, but I didn't use the word open in the sense that not all interpretations are valid, and not all interpretations are equally valid.
And also it's evolving.
Yeah, in a sense that first of all there is a context to the text, which as you probably already know that Abdullah Sayyid talked about it. So you have to look at the verse and when was it revealed, what circumstances. So the background to the text that tells you a lot. So you cannot, it's not an open text in the sense that you just cannot interpret it without that context, right? So you have to take that context into account. But there are three things. You have to take that context into account. Then you also have to take into account how this verse relates to other parts of the Quran, right? And how does it fit in with other parts. And then you have to bring your own kind of engagement, your own knowledge, which could be subjective knowledge, into action. So there are 2 or 3 parameters within which you are operating. So it's not totally open in the Eco sense. In the postmodern, I'm not a postmodernist, as you probably know, not in the postmodern sense that any interpretation is equally valid. Not quite like that. The text itself guides you. So I give you just one example. I mean, the ghaib, the word unseen, occurs a number of times. Now I thought, okay, what is the unseen? You read the commentaries on that. It's almost always about hereafter, right? Or sometimes we believe in the unseen, meaning jinns and things like that. But actually, tomorrow is unseen.
Futures.
Right? Next week is unseen. 10 years from now. So if you just said that this particular term and the term of the future in the Quran occurs in use the different terms occur. If you use that as a future, right? Then the context, the meaning of the sentence changes quite drastically. It doesn't mean that trying to quote if I can, it's not just saying that you will be accountable in the hereafter. It is also saying you will be accountable in the future, which could be in 10 years' time, because then the account will come in straight away. So your actions now will generate certain consequences 10 years' time. So you can read it like that. But then you have to bring in the perspective of the future to actually see that text. But the text then itself guides you.
I guess this is only one of the points on multiple levels that you can actually approach it.
Yeah.
Very nice, thank you so much. So I think we open the floor for the questions now.
You mentioned just now, if I understood that well, you need to understand few chapters to understand the Quran. Take, for example, Al-Fatihah and this Al-Baqarah. There's no need to read everything.
No, I didn't quite say that. I didn't quite say that. There's no need to read. I said that once, when you read the commentaries of, so you read the commentaries of a classical commentator, or even modern Abdullah Maududi, for example, right? The Tafsir of Qur'an. So you read his commentary on Fatiha, you read his commentary on Al-Baqarah. But when you come to the family of Imran, you find that he's just repeating what he was saying because the verses themselves are repeating itself. So there is a lot of repetition in that sense. So to my point, it doesn't quite make sense to just continue verse by verse interpretation right till the end. That's what I said. I didn't say it's not.
So because I'm referring to a translation of the Quran by Thomas Cleary. It translated only some chapters.
Yeah.
But that managed to represent the whole.
You can do that, yes, in a sense you can.
And I get a friend who said that you need to approach the Quran in a way that is free your mind from what you understood before. If you read the Quran, you will understand Arabic a bit, you will understand the Quran. Every time you read, a new perspective will.
Absolutely.
Is that true?
This is exactly what I found in a sense. When I did the conceptual kind of analysis, taking one concept and see how that concept occurs in the text in a number of different places and how it relates to each other, you get a totally new layer of meaning, right? Then if you just take a particular verse and where that particular concept occurs, so in fact the nature of the concept itself changes as you move through the text in that sense. But if you could not find new meaning, then there would be no need for new interpretations. The fact that we've had a number of interpretations in history and even contemporary times suggests that there is new meaning. And then as society moves and changes, new problems arise, new ethical and moral issues emerge, and then you need to tackle them, right? And then you go back to the text. The text forces you to ask questions about these ethical issues, and then you yourself have to come up with the answers.
But practically,
the text provides the guide. It is a book of guidance in a sense that the text guides you towards the answer, but does not give you the answer.
Okay, is that actually that's a clear indication that slavery is not accepted, but it's not explicit in the Quran, but it is being it's explicit, implicit in the way that it is being practiced. But on the modern world cannot accept slavery. Is there any indication in the Quran that even the hudud can be abrogated?
You see, it's again, I did say that the conscience plays a great deal of part in that. I mean, you have to see the context in that sense. So, and just illustrate that with another example. The example of polygamy, which is very common in a sense. There was in that society a common practice of marrying, numerous times. Right. Now, the idea, the final goal is to introduce monogamy, if you like. But how is that introduced? In a very playful way, saying, okay, you can marry 1, 2, 3, 4, but only if you can do justice to them. But then you cannot do justice to them, right? In a sense. So the text is really genuinely ambiguous, right? And it lets you kind of come to the conclusion that you want that your conscience accepts. So many people will say, "Oh yeah, four wives are allowed in Islam," which in fact has become a kind of
big issue.
Yeah, no, accepted law more or less, right? That you can allow. But then if you step back and say consciously, well, actually, no, you cannot do justice to 4 people, to 4 wives simultaneously in the sense. But then the issue of justice is very important. You see, why can't the woman marry 4 husbands? That's the issue of justice as well. Yeah. So why just polygamy, not polyamory, right? Allow, and then you will say it had to do with the inheritance, it had to do with the children's rights and identity. I mean, so the issue is very, very complex. You have to kind of look at the whole thing to reach a conclusion. And I think the conclusion has to be based on your own conscience. There is that freedom. And so I think a lot of Hudud laws are in the same position. Right? I mean, in a sense, they are directed towards a particular society at a particular time in history, and you have to see them from that perspective. And then almost always you find that, and forgiveness is better, and forgiveness is better, and forgiveness is better in that sense. So ultimately, I would say it is arguing for a totally different direction of law than it's commenting on in that sense. And that's where the evolutionary aspect comes in. You have to see that, or you have to have the ability to see that. But then you see, when you engage with your text, as a believing Muslim, you bring your own subjectivity to the text, in a sense. You are reading into the text as well as the text, whatever the text may be telling you in that.
The Quran, sometimes you can interpret it in terms of moral values, sometimes justice. But when you compare it to other texts like Hinduism, you will see that they are addressing human issues, act of revenge, jealousy. But here, the Quran doesn't really tell us how do you tackle these human emotions. It's always like moralistic. Yes, you should forgive, let it go, that sort of thing. So did you find some place, or that is the interpretation that is left to us that we need to come up with?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of passion in the Quran, in a sense.
Because like if you see the Hindu text, even the gods are fighting among themselves, and they are teaching you things. How do you?
I mean, in that sense, there are lots of kind of allegorical stories and things. Story of Musa, story of Khazar, story of Yusuf, etc., etc. There are stories that are there for that purpose.
Yeah.
But there is a great deal of passion in the Quran, and the passion begins with the words, the sounds itself. The sound. Ultimately, for me, the Quran is sound. In that sense, I mean.
And the second thing I wanted to, you are so prolific and you write so much. How do you organize, and how do you select certain themes to write about? What motivates you, or how does it just now you began the whole thing? But if I go on the website, it is such a wide area that you write about. So how do you like select and organize writing and so much?
Well, there are two answers to this. One answer is that if you're making a living, then you type fast. Okay, you think fast and you type fast if you're making a living. So I have been a kind of professional writer, although I've also been a professional teacher at universities and all that. But everything else has come secondary, and my primary goal has been to write things in certain way. I have had reasonable success. So there have been some books which have allowed me to write certain other books. So I wrote Why do people hate Islam? It sold in millions. So I was able to kind of live off that book for 3-4 years and do other books, heavy intellectual stuff which would not have otherwise been written because I didn't have. Or sometimes when I am writing and finding it difficult to meet and meet, I've been able to go to university and say, okay, I'm going to get a teaching job for next 3-4 years or whatever. So there have been, and then I've done journalism as well, television, radio, all sorts of stuff. But my primary goal has been to write, and also the way kind of I consciously kind of, if you like, played my writing career is to write books which are not particularly brilliant, but they do make money, and then write books which I think are brilliant, but may not necessarily make money. And I also written some textbooks that went on selling. So my textbook on Orientalism, for example, is still a set text at Open University, and it kind of sells a few hundred copies every year. And there are some other texts which sell quite a lot. So there is that kind of balance. So I've done scholarly stuff, which for which you don't get advance, and I've done books for which you get a reasonably big advance to write. So it's been, in a sense, quite a balanced approach, if you like, which has managed, which enabled me. That does not mean that I have not had a very hard time. There have been times which have been very, very hard. Yeah. But then, if you want to do something like that, you have to have a little bit of suffering, don't you? Without suffering, you don't really get that.
In every profession is that.
Your question,
Thank you.
Thank
Your question, sir?
I have a question about the evolutionary aspect of the Quran that you mentioned. And from there, I want to take it towards a wider question.
Yeah.
As you know, there isn't a lot of agreement, even among traditionalists, about the order of revelation of the Quran, which makes us it makes it quite difficult to talk about the evolution of certain specific themes when we don't know which verse was revealed before the other one.
Yes.
But even if we look beyond that, we look at the social context and historical context, we have to rely upon extra Quranic or extra textual sources which are not of the same authenticity as the Quran. And this presents, of course, a problem for interpretation. Even when you talk about if you took, for example, Shia interpretations, Ibadi interpretations, Mu'tazili interpretations, they might even have different versions of the history.
True.
So my question really is, to what extent did you rely upon traditional sources in understanding the context in order to interpret the Quran?
The answer is limited. So I took essentially, as I said, Muhammad Ayyub's Quran and its interpreters, and Sajid Rizvi's 2-volume, I've forgotten the title of it, I think it's something like the classical and modern commentaries in the Quran, something like that, and just limited myself to what these guys were saying. You can get lost in that kind of historiography if you wanted to. Right? There is so much stuff out there, and quite a lot of it is contradictory, quite a lot of it is controversial, and scholars are fighting, arguing with each other and fighting each other. You can get lost with that. So I just took it as a priority. Given if these traditional scholars are saying that, okay, I'm going to accept that for the sake of argument. Otherwise, I wanted to go forward in that sense. But I would also say that there's more or less general agreement what are Makkan surahs and what are Medinan surahs, and that they give us a reasonable good chronology. So we have reasonably good idea, of when was a particular verse was revealed and when it wasn't. Although there is always going to be a controversy and unspecific timing, etc., etc. And the abrogation is I actually don't really believe in the idea of abrogation. In a sense, if you take the text as a integrated organic whole and you abrogate certain part, to me intellectually then the text ceases to be organic whole. Right? It's not a question of
there's also the point that there is no agreement on what
in a sense. So I think this is where your conscience comes in, and you have to interpret it, saying this is me and I'm bringing my own self to this understanding of the text, and God has given me a conscience. Then I do feel, as part of my fitra, that there's certain things which are not quite right, and therefore if the text didn't raise those issues, then the struggle wouldn't be there. If you see what I mean.
I would, if you would allow me, I mean the verse that is actually used is very illustrative. The verse that is used to explain or to argue for abrogation is also from Surah Al-Baqarah. ما ننسخ من آية أو نمحها نأتي بخير منها أو مثلها. The issue is that if you read that verse in its context, in the textual context, not social context, in the textual context, before that the Quran is talking about the miracles of Bani Israel, and it's saying that we're not going to show you any of those miracles, and then it comes to that. So it seems to me, in my reading of the Quran, that it's not actually mentioning abrogation at all. It's simply saying that we used to show really enormous miracles, and we're not showing them anymore because we have reason.
Yeah, reason. Yeah, in that sense.
So in a sense, even the interpreters, not only do they not agree upon which is abrogated and which isn't, they also don't agree if there is such a thing as abrogation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Any more questions? Saeed, please, you can go ahead.
Two questions, because we often have discussions with my friends, Muslims, non-Muslims. And so the first question is this. You mentioned that there is a degree of subjectivity, or that your conscience also comes into play. So then if there is subjectivity or conscience, can you say that there is such a thing as Islamic law or divine law, where one's conscience and one's own thoughts are put into it, and if you take it in a community level, then basically communities are deciding what the law is. So there is essentially no God's law. That's number one. Number two, people tell me this, they ask me this question and I don't know how to answer them. They say the Quran is more of a worldly book than it is a divine book. They say that we live two lives, the here and the hereafter. And so, but if you look at the Quran and if you look at the 5 pillars of Islam, we have prayers, fasting and all that. But prayers are not defined in the Quran. They don't elaborate prayers, and it's so fundamental. Fasting is also not elaborated. Zakat, the rate is not determined in the Quran itself. There's no guidance whatsoever. And it's left to the subjectivity of the person, which goes back to my first question, whether there is an Islamic law. But if you look at the other aspect of it, the Quran has a lot of worldly illustrations. For example, it talks about divorce, it talks about the distribution of property, and it uses proportions, very specific proportions. It talks about conception. So from your reading of it, wouldn't you agree that the Quran is more a worldly book than it is a divine book? And what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, there are actually several questions here. What was the first one? About divine law, in a sense. You see, I mean, we regard Sharia as divine, but I would argue there's hardly anything in the Sharia that is divine. The only thing divine in the Quran the only thing divine in Islam is the Quran. So anything derived from the Quran cannot really be divine. It can only be an interpretation, and therefore it's a human interpretation, right? So I would argue there's no such thing as God's law, right? And therefore I mean, I've been arguing for a long time that hardly any aspect of Sharia that is divine. In a sense, if God gave us everything, if God gave us law and laid it down, do this, do that, then what is the point of our existence? Right? In that sense, what is the point of a believer? Are we just, as I was saying earlier on, are we just empty vessels into which this thing is poured in and that's it? Right? Or do we have an intellect that we need to engage and think about? We have eyes to see and ear. Qur'an says that ears to hear and nose to smell, brain to think with, and a innate conscience that also provides us with some notion of what is moral and what is not. If we have all these faculties, what are these faculties for in that sense? So that's but the other question, of course, the Quran is as worldly as it needs to be, I suppose, is the answer. I would also argue the Quran is a very rational text because it keeps asking you to use reason, think, have you not been here, have you not traveled? So you can also argue, I think 750 verses are just on the use of, what I would call on rationality, observation and things like that. So you can argue it's also a very, very rational text, most of the surahs towards the end are very metaphysical, so you can argue it's also a very spiritual text in a sense. But the important thing is that it is commentary on the life of the Prophet, whatever was going on, and that was a full life, lived in the light of history. So whatever happened in that life is reflected in the Quran and the problems of that society.
How do you discuss it, whether individual interpretations are valid or not, which are better than the others?
Yes.
Now, the Quran is actually a very concrete text. It discusses actually issues that the Prophet lived.
Yeah.
It came down, so the asbabun nuzul, there is the relationship of the verse to the actual concrete event. So now to just simply say any interpretation, people can have different interpretations, and if all of them are equally valid, if not they're equally valid, then which one is more valid than the other?
That's equally valid. I said that the text does have certain contours, if you like, within which you have to operate. And one of them is, as you rightly pointed out, is the context of the verses. So the life of the Prophet, in that sense, is very, very important. I regard the Quran as a commentary on the life of the Prophet, if you like, right? So in that sense, you do have to see that context. So that's the first.
It's a very
in some cases very concrete, but not in every case. So that's one particular contour. And then the text itself has an envelope, if you like, which provides a second contour, because you have to see how the text interacts with each other and how various parts. So that's the other contour. But the third contour has to be you who are reading the text in that sense. So you've got to bring your own knowledge. You see, for example, if you are a great professor of astrophysics or astronomy or something, and I am, say, just a lowly school teacher, I'm going to read the text from my little perspective, and you're going to read the text, you're going to bring your knowledge and your subjectivity to the text. So the two of you will get different things out of the text in that sense. So that subjectivity is also there. Then you can argue amongst yourselves to say which particular interpretation is valid or not. But the interpretations are not wild, because they do come within the contours of the text. But the interpretations are time dependent, in the sense that you may bring the problems of your society, the problems of your period into play from that point of view.
In fact, it is very necessary. I would agree.
If we have different interpretations, which one is more valid than the other? There must be some sort of a more objective way of doing it. You have the very conservative.
You can let reason and rationality decide which is more valid than the other, rather than. But why do you have to argue that one is more valid than the other? Why can't you just
that
accept
has
that
to be-
your particular perspective enriches you, from your point of view, and your particular perspective enriches you? The problem arises when you say to me that your interpretation is more valid than mine, and that therefore your interpretation should be imposed on me. That's where the problem arises.
I wouldn't put it as imposed on you, but
Yeah.
there must be a more authoritative interpretation or a more acceptable interpretation. It's not a free-for-all. A free-for-all means, like your argument just now, whether the Sharia law actually exists.
Yeah.
Because it's anyone can interpret any way they want. There is no law. But law in itself is a decision by a whole community.
Yeah.
So even though there are parts of the community that don't agree with the law. So if you wanted to say, oh, any law is fine, any interpretation is fine, then we have a problem. There's no interpretation there.
But
Can I just
yeah,
maybe
I mean that's a
expand-
discussion rather than me just answering that.
Alright.
I'm sure there are other people who, yeah,
Can I just expand this with a case study maybe?
yeah,
For me, there is at the end of the day a collective manifestation of the interpretation in the
Yeah.
community.
and there has to be ijma of some
Yeah,
kind.
so I'll give you a case example.
Yeah.
How did we get the dog so wrong?
How did we what?
Get the dog so wrong in terms of purity and impurity. When we compare between
dog.
yeah, the dogs.
Yeah, okay.
When we compare between Hanafi and Shafi'i communities.
Yeah.
Yeah, Maliki,
Yeah.
yeah. So I mean that can be an example, I guess,
Yeah.
of how this collective interpretation leads to varying degrees of understanding.
You see, I mean, in a sense, if you want the most authoritative interpretation, in contemporary times, is the Wahhabi interpretation. So the Saudi interpretation. All right. I mean, in the sense, it's the most authoritative because we regard. I mean, what does the King of Saudi Arabia describe himself as? Is the Khadim al-Haramain. He is looking after Makkah and Medina, the legacy of Islam, and of course that's where all the top. Arabic-speaking scholars are, so on and so forth. So that should be the most valid in that sense. But to my mind, that's probably the most corrupt, in a sense. But if you look at it, in fact, it is quite corrupt. Now, if a dozen of us sat down to look at that interpretation, we would find problem with it, largely first of all, from a point of view of conscience more than anything else. Then we can go to the text and say, actually, text doesn't say that women should cover themselves in black, right? Actually, the text doesn't mention the color black at all, right? So there's something else is going on, and the text doesn't say that the women should cover themselves as a shroud, right? So there's a problem here as well. So we can go and look at that and say, actually, the text also asks men to do something, right? And it doesn't actually define, how should women express their modesty. So maybe the question of modesty is a question of interpretation. What do we define? I mean, some people, there is in certain Pakistani circles, if 3 hair of a woman are showing here, there'd be a riot. Yeah, right. So there's somebody, this is not a problem of Islam or text, it's a problem of mental pathology, right? These people are pathologically mad. They're using a particular interpretation or excuse to justify their pathology, if you like. So while I'm not saying that it's free for all, I am saying it is democratic in the sense that each individual has to kind of has an engagement with the text, and then we can negotiate some sort of consensus, if you like, right? In a sense, but I think what the text does not allow you to say is that your interpretation is more valid than mine. I don't think the text allows you to say that. We, amongst ourselves, can sit back and say, actually, this makes more rational sense than that. And in fact, this is how Ijma was developed in a.
I'm sitting here and the book in front of me says
Yeah,
Imam Ali and political leadership.
Yeah.
There was an incident in the time of Imam Ali when he was arguing with the Khawarij.
Yeah.
And he sent his cousin, Abdullah ibn Abbas, to argue with them. And he actually said this very openly. He said, لا تجادلهم بالقرآن. Do not argue with them by the Quran. فإنه حمال أوجه, because the Quran has multiple interpretations.
Yeah.
وإنه لا ينطق وَلَكِنْ يَنْطِقُ عَنْهُ الرِّجَالِ. The Quran does not speak, it is people who speak on its behalf. So, and this is Ali, who is basically the cousin of the Prophet, one of the most authoritative people. If he wanted to impose an authoritative interpretation, he would. And nobody would be more, of his cohort, nobody would be.
I tell you two things. One I only discovered today, the other I discovered a month or so ago, which disturbed me a great deal about Malaysia. I got an email from somebody saying that the ulama here are about to declare or are thinking of declaring or some movement or something that Shia are kafir. Yeah. I mean, what an abomination. I mean, Shia are a phenomenally great community. They are an integral part of Islam. They started at the beginning of Islam, right? To say that they are kafir is it is such a, I cannot even imagine. I was shaking in anger when I heard what is wrong with us. What is wrong with us? That reveals that we have no respect. It would tell me that we have no notion of God. Right? We do not really recognize the majesty of God. We think God is like a leader of the Quraysh, right? Leader. Tribal leader who's angry and he says, right now you buggers, I'm declaring you, null and void. This is is to deny history, is to deny that more than one interpretation can exist. It's the most ridiculous thing. Then today I was reading that lots of answer photograph in the Star as well. They were demonstrating against. What is it called? The international against racial discrimination. Now I understand perfectly well that the Malay community has been marginalized, even though it's a majority, has some serious problems. The problem of poverty now, for example. But all that has got nothing to do with race. Islam is unequivocally about equality of human. If you stand up as a Muslim and say I am against, an anti-racist convention, then you don't understand what Islam is all about, or you don't have no notion of what your identity is about. You can stand up and say I am for this convention, but as Malay community we have certain problems that must also be addressed. And some of them are in the constitution, therefore they should be handled in that way. But you can't stand up and say, I am against. Can you see how it looks to the rest of the world? It looks to the rest of the world that you are racist. That's how, if I was watching that in London, right, with my children, they will turn around and say, Malaysians are racist. Look, right? Imagine the whole world is watching that. That is what they see, that Malaysians are racist. But actually, if they know a little bit about the region, they will say Malays are racist, not Malaysian. Right? If they know anything, if they know that all the hijabified ladies are actually identifying themselves as Muslim, and here Malay and Islam are the same thing, then they will say, the Malays are racist in a sense. Right? So we have to just step back and think, right? And slightly, what are we doing to ourselves? Actually, we are not doing anything to our religion, because ultimately it all boils down to us. What are we doing to ourselves? When we do that. If, for example, I say that Shias are not part of my community, I am a Sunni by the way, although it doesn't it makes no sense to me whether I am Sunni or not. Right? I am a thinker, I approach things in a particular way. But I happen to be Ahl Sunnah wal Jamaat because that's where I was, that's where I grew up. Fine, okay, that's okay. But if I say that Shias are not, I have truncated my own humanity. I have reduced my history into a little fraction. I have denied, what am I going to say about Mullah Sadra? What am I going to say about Nizami, right? What am I going to, say about the whole kind of Persian art and miniatures, and what I'm going to say about the Isfahan Mosque, right? And they are not part of me because they are outside. I've truncated my history, I've truncated my identity, I've destroyed myself, right? I'm a truncated human being if I say that. Right? So I'm actually damaging myself. I'm not damaging the Shia, by the way. They're going to continue to exist no matter what I'm going to say.
Could this also be part of this enclosing, circling identity that's happening all over the world with far-right movements, the identity obsession, making the circle closing, nearer and nearer, excluding others.
Yeah, I think there is a global trend.
It could be interconnected.
In that sense of kind of. I mean, identity is becoming problematic in a globalized world, and therefore. But I don't really think so. You see, one thing that I have learned in this exercise. I mean, I don't describe that book as a tafsir. All I'm saying, that book is essentially my engagement with the text. This is how I did it. This is what I discovered, and this is how. And hopefully, it's much readable than any tafsir you can come across, because I can write. But what I have learned, one kind of solution from reading from doing this exercise, which lasted over 4 years, is that there's nothing special about Muslims. Right? A number of places we are told we can replace you with another. In fact, a friend of mine said, this is very interesting, God can replace us with robots. Because it doesn't define who is going to replace us with in this sense. Which suggests that there is nothing special about us. Right? We are like all other human communities. We have our criminals, we have our left-wing people, we have our right-wing people, we have our angelic people, we have a good. That's what a human community is. We are like a human community. How do we better ourselves with? Is the question, right? How do we improve our lot? And I think that's where it is essential as a believing community for us to go to the Qur'an for guidance. And as I said, you have to find the answer. The text guides you towards.
And it's a process.
Towards a potential answer, but you have to find and your conscience as individual and as community, I think, is very, 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 very important at the end of the day.
Ali, you had a question.
Actually, on a different take, your experience with critical Muslim, and just your thought or comments on the current state of affairs in the intellectual world overall in the Muslim community, and especially when it comes to the question of interpretation or reinterpretation of Islam. If you would like to, make a broad commentary, are you hopeful that this kind of rational, free thinking, which is there, which has been exhibited by many individual scholars like you, but then has it been sort of accepted, normalized in Muslim majority societies, or it's like still in the West? You are in London, somewhere in US.
What does you say? People who think, I assume that there are some people in this room who fulfill that criteria.
But broadly in terms of intellectual.
The question is, have we reached a critical mass or not? The answer is, I don't think we have reached a critical mass. Essentially, we are in vast majority of Muslims do not have confidence in their own faith. They think if somebody else attacks their faith, it will crumble. Or they think if somebody a different kind of Muslim emerges, right? Then they are threat to this, very deep. So critical Muslim, the first issue was called The Arabs Are Alive, which was about Arab Spring. It came out about the same thing. The second issue was called The Idea of Islam. The first issue, we shipped 100 copies here, and I think it sold or something. Second issue, we sent 100 copies here. They were compounded, and whoever was in the authority said, this is not the sort of thing we want in Malaysia, because it is questioning certain things that we do not question, right? And the issue certainly was questioning a lot of things. It was questioning the nature of hadith. Why do you believe hadiths which are totally irrational, etc., etc. And then the critical Muslim never appeared here. We had an arrangement with Pakistan, OU, Oxford University, West Pakistan. So they published the first issue. They published the second issue and removed one particular article from it. The third issue, they didn't print it out. Fourth issue was about Pakistan, so they printed and then they cancelled the contract. Third issue was called Fear and Loathing. That was the theme. And there was an article about beards written by me towards the end, which was a very kind of a sarcastic look at Muslim beards, right? and the nature of Muslim beards, right? The Tablighi beard looks like that, the Wahhabi beard looks like that, and there was this kind of, comments, satirical comments, and I started off by saying clearly God has a problem with hair because he seems to wants to hide the hair of all women, and he seems to insist that all the believers of whatever religion must have facial hair. So the priests tend to have hair, the rabbis have the beard, and the hair. So, I mean, this is how it started. And so the Oxford University Press Pakistan, which one assumes is a group of people who think, right, said this is blasphemous, and it will cause riots here, and the Taliban will come and burn our offices. So the third issue was not published in the country. So no. Critical Muslim, when we were thinking of the journal, there was a Muslim Institute trustees, and we started off saying, what should we call it? Shall we call it Critical Islam? Half the people fainted.
Yeah.
So we are not going to call it Critical Islam, we're going to call it Critical Muslim. One trustee said no, there cannot be such a thing as Critical Muslim. That means you are criticizing Islam and saying Islam is not good enough. And that became an issue, and she resigned. She left.
She or he?
She left. They said, no, we cannot have critical Muslim. Actually, so we have problems within our own community. And to me, it reflects a very basic thing, that we do not have confidence in our own faith.
Faith or intellect?
To begin with faith.
To begin with faith.
Faith. Yeah.
Okay. I thought that we also have no confidence in the reason.
We clearly we do not also have confidence in our thought processes, because in most cases we don't have any. But where we do have, there's clearly hope. I'll give you a couple of examples of hope. I went to Pakistan a couple of years' time to Lahore Book Festival and to Karachi Book Festival. And in both occasions it was about my book, Makkah, the Sacred City, which is a history of Makkah, and really shows that Makkah was never a peaceful place. It has a pretty violent history, and pretty, it's not a sanctuary as we have believed. And basically, Qur'an describes Makkah as a barren valley. It's not barren anymore, it's not a valley anymore, right? So there's some serious problem with that. So that's what the book is about. And when I went to Lahore, it was a huge, they have a huge place where they actually have the thing, and the halls are designed for about 2,000 people. Alhambra, yeah, there were 2,000 people there. More than half of them were women. And one, they had read the book, and two, they had serious questions to ask. The men sat there quietly, either accepting the book totally or rejecting it. To me, both are pretty bad. If I write something and you don't find any fault with it, that means you have not thought about it. Because you will bring your perspective in it, and from your experience you will see something missing, right? Or something additional that, in a sense. So even if you praise it, you have to praise it in a critical way, or if you're rejecting it, you have to reject it in a critical way. Men just sat there, so either they liked it or didn't like it, but the women were engaged. Exactly the same thing happened in Karachi. Then a couple of years ago, I went to Bradford Literary Festival. Bradford Literary Festival was only 3 years old, maybe 3 years old. And two Pakistani women started it. And they came to me 4 or 5 years ago, and they said Bradford has a very bad reputation. So when you think of Bradford, what do you think of? Think of book burning, you think of race riots, two things. How can we So that's the idea came along. So I supported them, and so the first Bradford Book Festival, I went there, and part of my job was not just to talk in the festival and all that, but to actually go to a girls' school and spend 3 or 4 hours at the girls' school. Now, it should not surprise you that most schools in Bradford are populated by Muslim pupils. They are government schools, they are, right? But because Bradford has a large Muslim population, so most of them are Muslim. Right? So I went to girls' school, sixth form girls' school, and it was early in the morning, and I was tired. And I said, "Guys, this is girls' school, who cares? Very girls' time." So the topic was everything you always want to know about Islam, but were afraid to ask. Right? So I went in the school, and there was a small little chair, and the teacher, lovely teacher, she said, "Would you like to sit in a chair?" I looked at the chair and kind of discussed how I'm going to fit in this chair, you see, and there was all these girls there, right? So I said, "No, I'll stand." They said, "Would you like to say?" I said, "No, I don't have to speak. The topic of the thing is, everything you're afraid to ask, so you ask, and I'll answer." So the girl puts her hand, I said, "Yes." She said, "These are exact questions." She said, "How do we know the will of God?" So I looked at her, I looked at the small chair, and I said, "I better sit down." So I sat down in the small chair. So I said to her, why are you asking the question?" She said that we are told that we must cover our hair, it's the will of God. We are told that if we go out, we must have moral vigor because it's the will of God. But how do we actually know the will of God? Right? This is the sixth former, 16, 17 years old, hijabified. So I said, "Look, this is a very difficult question. Can we take some other questions before I answer this one?" So several girls, this is about 50 girls, several girls raised their hand. So I said, "You, one who was not hijabified ever, what do you have to ask?" She said, "Do you think there is some way that Islam and postmodernism can be reconciled?" I said, "What?" She said, "In your essay," and she was holding my collection of my, it's called the Reader, and it's designed for postgraduate, it's not for sixth formers. So I said, "Have you read it?" She said, "Yeah, I read it all." Teacher gave us to all of us, we've all read it. So here you say, "But I think," she said, "there is some way we can reconcile." So I said, "Well, this is going to be a real discussion." So the small chair suddenly became a throne. I kind of said, "Okay, now let's talk about it properly." This is a sixth form girls' school. And so 3 years ago, I published a little book called Islam Beyond Violent Jihadis. You should be able to get it. And it begins with this story. The book begins with the story of my going to the secondary school and the girls, all the questions they asked. Basically, it's just my engagement with the questions and the way it's and then it goes to other things. If you have young girls asking questions like that, imagine when they grow up, because they are going to replace the powers that be at this moment, and they will be it be a different ballgame, right? And they will not tolerate certain things that are tolerated at the moment. I think, and that's a real. This is why I think that paradise lies in the feet of the mother, because the mothers, when these girls become mothers, they're going to change the world, and hopefully they'll change their sons, which is probably more important than anything else, right?
As long as they are not following their husbands all the time.
Yeah, but this is the other side of the story. And a lot of these girls are not marrying because they can't find. So there's a big crisis. And I know from my own children and my daughter's friends, she has lots of friends, and they are all in the same boat. The boys who are emerging now, the teenage boys and early 20s, they are not as highly educated or articulate or thinking individuals as the girls are. There is a real thing.
Right.
And I saw that in Pakistan, and I see that. I certainly saw it in Bradford. And the following year, by the way, I went to a boys' school, and the questions were the most mundane. What should be the length of my beard variety? And should I turn my thingy like that because my father says I can't pray like that. So that was the level of their questions. So you can see the immediate contrast. Immediate contrast between the two. So there is a great, and these girls will be reading the Qur'an in their own way, and that's where the subjectivity comes along. They will interpret it in their own way, and they will fight for their interpretations, and I will be on their side. even if I disagreed with their interpretation. Right? I will be on their side.
I kind of want to pick up on what
Yeah.
you mentioned about the difference between the girls and the boys.
Yeah.
And I feel that what's unsaid over here is that unfortunately we have a patriarchal tradition. So these girls, they have to struggle with this tradition at a very young age in a way that young boys don't have to.
Yes.
Which really brings me to my actual question. The real epidemic that's going on right now, which is probably unsaid, is that a lot of Muslims are losing their faith. And unfortunately, a lot of these girls might grow up not to be Muslim at all. So what do you speak to that?
This is the interesting point. And I tell you, my son, I have 3 children. My eldest is a daughter, and I have 2 sons. And the youngest son, I mean, it's a Muslim family, so I never said to them, "You are Muslim," right? I said to them, "Find out yourself." So the youngest son wanted to do philosophy, right? So he did philosophy as a first degree, he did philosophy, and just finished his PhD. So when he finished his first degree, and he was about to go to LSE to do his master in political philosophy, he took me and his godmother, Relevance Davis, who is my friend and colleague, to a restaurant. I would like to take you. After thinking very seriously and all that, I've decided that I'm an atheist. So me and Meryl and sitting there with him, so I said, okay, well, what else is new? So we started talking and said, Dad, you did not listen to me. But after thinking this and reading this and then, I decided that I'm an atheist. So we carried on talking and he got very upset. Why aren't you angry with me? Why should I be angry with me? This is the conclusion that you have reached. Right? Yeah. Okay, fine. Carry on. Let us see what happens. Then he started reading, and one day he came along and he said, I read the philosopher's book on being. I said, yes. He said, I get for the philosophy I read. I've never read anything like that. I said, have you read the whole book? I saw the book and he had every page marked, comment here. I said, well, actually, there are other books that I just on. So I gave you other book on philosophy. And then slowly his perspective changed. Because what did he read at university? Greek, modern Greek philosophy,
It's almost as if
postmodernism, Hegel, there's standard text that you go through.
When you read history of intellectual thought, it's almost as if there's nothing in between.
Yeah. So once he starts reading the thing and see how profound it is, right? Then he begins to think, right? In a sense, and then so he's transformed, right? Now that's what I will call bottom up, rather than top down, right? In a sense. Now, if these girls are very allowed to grow bottom up, I don't think they're going to leave Islam. I think they're going to become even better Muslims than we are. But that's where patriarchy comes in. If patriarchy tries to suppress them, then they will rebel for sure. And rebellion will be against Islam, not just against parents. The parents are only a metaphor. They're not rebelling against an oppressive father. They're rebelling against what they think is an oppressive ideology, which is imposed by the father. Right? So that's how. So that's where the whole dynamic lies.
It's not only rebelling against the family, it's also rebelling against the institution.
Against the institution.
Because the Islamic institutions almost everywhere are very patriarchal and they are like very exclusive towards this kind of school girls coming in. And honestly, the issue is not only within Muslim societies, it's elsewhere as well, whereby at school level, the girls do very well, but when it comes to industry level, to certain positions within corporations and the glass ceiling and all that, they sort of disappear. So it's not because of their lack of abilities, it's because of this kind of sometimes very, very hidden and invisible discrimination.
A quick comment regarding the earlier point, the issue of subjectivity and objectivity. In my honest view, I think that we look at it in a vacuum or in isolation without considering how the ripple effect would be. For example, it's true that every person may have their own interpretation, But at the end of the day, if you look at our institutions, we still elect people to vote who would represent us. So I think in a way it's democratic, where the society agrees upon an interpretation, or the majority of the society agrees upon an interpretation. Currently what we're doing is, we're told that only certain groups of society are allowed to interpret Islam, and so they formulate these councils who say that you can't read the Quran, I will read it for you and tell you what it says. And so then you have one view imposed on you, and you're not allowed to comment. So I think that is something that needs to be looked at. But on the flip side, there's the other issue on how do you deal with moral issues which relate to the law. For example, homosexuality is one thing, and if I'm not wrong, there's a story in the Quran of Sodom and Gomorrah, and people use that to say that religion or Islam does not condone homosexuality. So what would be your view? How do you think the Quran actually interprets homosexuality? Do you think it prohibits it? And in any event, how would you fit that into the social context, social legal context?
I think homosexuality is just beginning of the issue, because the way things are moving forward, we are going to have far more frightening issues, if you like, than just the question of homosexuality. When I was reading that, I found that in the story of Prophet Lot and his, and I also read the interpretation around it. There are two or three issues as you read the chapter on homosexuality. There are two or three issues here. First of all, a number of contemporary scholars interpret the Luth case as not directed towards homosexuality, but directed against a certain kind of sexual extremism and certain amount of kind of barbarity associated with it, which to my mind, reading the verses, does make sense. But just by reading the verses, you can't be for or against homosexuality. It is an ambiguous interpretation. Therefore, one simply cannot take a stand, just like that, one way or the other. And I think that's why the ambiguity has lasted for so long, because the verses are, in a sense, ambiguous. And that's not just about homosexuality. Lots of verses in the Quran are, I think, ambiguous because the text wants you to explore and text wants you to think. So then it comes back to the argument, and there are two or three things to consider. First, we know that homosexuality has existed throughout history, which is not something new. We also know that Muslims had some great homosexuals. So Abu Awaf, the preeminent Arabic poet, was a raging homosexual, a passing period. We know that the Mamluks were, raging homosexuals. So we probably only have the distinction of having a dynasty that of aggressively homosexuals. Okay, so homosexuality is not something that is unknown to Islam. So that's the first thing. In a sense, it has existed throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we
saying unknown to Islam and saying unknown to our history is a bit different?
Yeah, no, right, agree. So then we come back to the second point, that either homosexuality is a genetic thing or it is not a genetic thing. Now, if it's a genetic thing, then you have to accept that it's a God-given thing, and then you cannot be against it. It's like being against somebody who's white because somebody who's black. So it's the same kind of discrimination will enter. You have to treat in a sense. Or it is not a God-given thing. Then you can make up your own mind in that sense. Now, to me, we know from contemporary science that it is in fact a genetic thing, right? And therefore, I think it is unreasonable for Muslims to be against homosexuality. Now, how do we go from here is a different issue, and that's a social issue that we need to kind of discuss, because the Lut verses are the Prophet Lot's verses are a kind of quite a good guidance, because they are about extremism in that sense. And to my mind, certain aspects of homosexuality as expressed in the West do take it to an extreme level. And I would for example, object to the fact that homosexuality has become a fashion. That is not what it's all about. And often it's a fashion that is imposed by various means. Creating fashion, creating desire, etc. About 10 years ago, even not 15 years ago, in fact, or even longer, when I used to work at TV3, I went to Singapore, and you folks may remember that, and the New Straits Times had a heading that such a school has become lesbian, right? And the government is taking action against it. The whole school had suddenly become lesbian. It had declared itself to be lesbian. And when I read the heading, I was working with some TV guys. We were doing some, I don't know whether any of you remember Money Matters, right? You remember Money Matters, right? So you know the opening sequence, I was doing that there. And I said, this is a bit ridiculous, right? How can a whole school suddenly, so let's find out, right? It turned out that this school, and the girls' age were all like 13, 14, and they had madly fallen in love with a pop group called Lipstick. And the pop group, this Lipstick pop group, they were aggressively lesbian. So without knowing anything, singing their songs, they just said, we are lesbians. Right? And the whole school, these things spread widely, and therefore suddenly caused a panic in the government, in a sense. Now, that's where I think things go to become ridiculous, in a sense, right? Just as I wouldn't say, that we should all follow a particular, fashion or whatever, it's sexual orientation. Let's accept it as that and move on. It's not. I don't want, just as I don't want you to tell me that you are a Sufi or a Wahhabi or something like every 5-10 minutes. I don't want a gay person to keep telling me he's gay. I accept, move on, right? It's not a big issue. But that's my position. But I do appreciate that many people, because the verses are ambiguous, many people may interpret it differently. And that's where then I have to decide, that's where his point where it comes along, whether I accept their interpretation or not as well, in that sense. However, no, let me just carry on. The issue now is not just homosexuality. I was one of the first commissioners, in fact, after the chair, vice chair, I was the first commissioner of Equality and Human Rights Commission in England when it was established in the early noughties. And one of my kind of area where I had to kind of act and look at legislation and all that was religious identity and gay and lesbian, right? In fact, I wrote a thing called The Language of Equality, which you can download still from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So we had to deal with LGBT, lesbian, bisexual, gay, transgender, etc. LGBT plus, right? That was like 10, 12 years ago, right? Then it became we had to deal with the LGBT, then it became LGBT plus. So you had to add queer and few others. And then it became even longer. Now you have to add different varieties. But, and this is the real thing, you must all do this. The best place to do this is to go to University of Durham LGBT plus society and look at how many different types of sexual orientation there are, like 20 or 30 different ones. And each one is demanding equality, and each one is demanding rights, and each one is demanding grant from, in this case, the union, because the union plays in society. But later on, of course, from the government as well, right? So that, I think, is now taking us. This is the profit loot level, right? Now we are in a really very, very weird thing. People in leather and it's just plastic. I don't know what, all sorts of stuff. But please do go to University of Durham LGBT site, student unions site, and they list these are the people we are representing, right? So now each of these raises a moral question for us, an ethical question for us, right, in a sense, and quite mind-boggling, right, in a sense, because at the end of the day, as Ibn Taymiyyah said, I'd rather live in a just society than live in an Islamic society. So that's Ibn Taymiyyah, for God's sake, who was, fanatically Muslim by any criteria. Okay. So at the end of the day, it is a question of justice, and we do not want to discriminate against anybody or think they are inferior in any way or project that. So how do we deal with that? Now, these are very sophisticated ethical and moral questions. And some of these people, if you look at their arguments, they do tend to make sense. Some of them, they certainly do not make sense to me either, so I have to correctly reject them. But some arguments do make sense. So we really have to look into this, which means the world is going to become even more complex, and we have to kind of interact with it. We cannot isolate ourselves with it, and of course many of these problems will become part of problems over society as well, and therefore we need to prepare for them and see. Maybe it's time to get back to the text once again.
It's not a question, it's just that I have 2 comments, or one comment and one question. First is, I feel like through this discussion from the beginning until now, is that there is a part that is being omitted, which is that God did not send the Holy Qur'an only. God sent the Holy Qur'an and the Prophet Muhammad. And in the Holy Qur'an, one of the verses that define a straight or a solid rule is that in Surah Al-Najm, God said, "La yantiqu anil hawa," referring to Prophet Muhammad, as in Prophet Muhammad will not say anything that is wrong or against Islam. In fact, everything he does or say is a rule that we should take the same way we take the rules in Quran. So for lots of questions and lots of arguments, such as, for example, this homosexuality thing, if we don't find any reference in the Quran, we still have the reference from the Sunnah, right? And if we go back to this, if we go back to the Sunnah, then the argument is done, right? We can no longer accept any discussion or any opinion from someone else, or how we would go. And the second thing is that just now you mentioned one point about this homosexuality, about whether it's genetic or not. From my perspective and from my understanding from the verses in Quran is that no verse ever mentioned that it does not exist, or whether or not it's genetic or not. It's actually, if you go deep into it, it's mentioned that part of us is our desire, and this desire, it's possible for any man to desire another man. It's not saying that this will not happen, but it's regulating us in a way that if we have this desire, we should not follow it. So it's not a matter of being genetic or non-genetic, and this is a misunderstanding that many people fall into. I just wanted to highlight that.
Are you telling me this, or are you asking me? If you're telling me this, that's I respect it. If you're asking me, then I'll give a different answer.
No, you feel free to comment.
Okay. All right. Okay. So let's look at life of the Prophet. The life of the Prophet is a life that existed in the 7th century, right? The Prophet could not do anything that, say, for example, would happen in the 9th or 10th century, right? So the Sunnah has a limit. It has a historical, a fixed historical boundary. That's the first thing. So many things that Sunnah has are no longer valid. And a ridiculous example would be about, people say, he rode a camel and now we ride it. But that's, I think, is a very simplistic example. Over rules of war, for example, are based on how the Prophet fought, but we don't fight like that anymore. So this is why the rules of the Islamic rules of war don't really function. Because there were no bombs there. I mean, killing somebody with a sword is a totally different exercise than shooting somebody from a distance. Right? The personal involvement is totally different in that sense. So that just to give you an example. And the Quran itself says that, say Muhammad, I am a man like you, like any other. So he is a human being. The definition of a human being is that human being is not fallible. Sorry, the human being is fallible, right? The Prophet is either he is a human being or he is not a human being. Right? The Quran clearly says that the Prophet is a human being. So there is that. So we have to kind of regard him. So our approach to the Prophet should be not to deny his humanity, but to accept his humanity, right? In a sense. So if we blindly imitate him, then we are denying his humanity. First thing we are denying is that he existed in history, and that history had a particular contours, right? It's a fixed history. It didn't have a, it didn't have a certain technology. It didn't have certain, economic formation. It didn't have certain concepts and ideas, etc., etc. It's a history. And there are many instances, hadiths and all that, where he himself admits, right, that the famous incident of the genetic manipulation of plants, where he tells the farmer to kind of not to do certain things, and the crops don't grow, and then he says, I'm not an expert in this, etc., etc. So there is that aspect of so we have to not idealize that period of history was not a utopia. Utopia is basically no place, no people. It was a human society, and therefore there were lots of mistakes and lots of problems with that society in that sense, in which the Prophet served as a model. Yeah, we accept him as such. So I think that's the first thing. My argument will be not to dehumanize the Prophet by turning him into an impossible ideal. Yeah, that's the first. The second thing, of course, as I kept on saying, that the Quran is a commentary on the life of the Prophet. Therefore, the two go together, and you do have to see the context. I have systematically kind of emphasized that. Just as I said that the Quran doesn't give complete answers to many questions, you have to discover them yourself. Similarly, the Sunnah does not give us an answer to everything in the universe, right? There are many issues that we need to. One of the first issues is we need to rethink what Sunnah is, in a sense. What is the significance of Sunnah in a contemporary world, which is so far removed from the world of the Prophet, right, in a sense. And in that world, can we do the kind of qiyas that classical fiqh did, and does it really make sense? I mean, to me it doesn't. First of all, I regard qiyas as a very poor logical tool, but apart from that, I don't think it makes much sense anyway. I come back to the thing that we have a conscience, and we have to decide certain things ourselves, and that's why I think he was the last prophet, in a sense that when this is to be what it means, that Muhammad is the last prophet, means that we have from here on, the moral responsibility is on us. There are sources that we have access to, but at the end of the day, the moral and ethical struggle is with us, and we have abandoned that struggle, and we take things as rules, written in history as fixed. That's why we are in the mess that we are in my opinion, in a sense. Because the moment you say that all the answers are in the life of the Prophet, then the question is, what are you for? What is your agency? Right? How do you engage with your sacred text? How do you live in this world? And how do you kind of engage with it critically and navigate it in this complexity? Navigate this complexity in a creative and ethical way.
Can I just comment?
Yeah.
Is that what I was trying to say is not that the Sunnah is covering everything, and I'm not saying that it has the answer for everything, that the answer for every question we have is either in the Qur'an or the Sunnah. Of course we have it all, and I do agree with you that we need to think and we need to use our minds, and that's what I often tell my friends, that the religion of Islam is for people who think, for people who question. It's not for people who accept and follow. I agree with you, but if we try and say that if we follow the verse that say Prophet Muhammad is a human being on the common concept of what human being is, then we are limiting our ability to think in that part. Because from my point of view is that when God told us that Prophet Muhammad is a human being, is for us to emphasize the fact that all the worshipping and all the efforts that the Prophet have made is within the human being power. It is that we can possibly do that. But at the same time, and this is a confirmed fact, that if you open the Holy Quran, Surah Al-Najm, as I mentioned, there is a verse that clearly says, "La yantiqu anil hawa," which translates to, he will not say anything that is based on his own opinion or something that is a human being mistake, because everything he says is inspired to him by God. It says in the same surah, which is part of the Holy Quran. It's one of the rules mentioned there. So we cannot just say that.
He would not live the human life if everything was, like that. I mean, we have countless cases where he is simply being human in more ways than one, and saying things. I mean, there is little further on. There is that incident where an old lady comes to him and he turns away from her, and the Quran says, how dare you do that? Same, little bit distance. So I wouldn't just pick up verse. This is one of the points I was raising.
It refers to the
You see, in a sense, to me, what the Sunnah only has conceptual relevance in contemporary times. So it's not what happened that is important, but what the Prophet did at certain moments in time. So, for example, it is battle of conquest of Makkah, about which a great deal has been written, is not relevant to me. What is relevant to me is that when the Prophet comes to Makkah and he asks the Makkans, what shall I do with you? And they answer, you are a good brother, you will do good. And he says, you are forgiven. That is a conceptual component. How he came, how many fight, who, Abu Hab was standing there and somebody was, that is all relevant to me. The only thing relevant is that, right? Because what does it say in his life? That forgiveness is a supreme value. At the moment of magnanimity, that is the only thing that counts. In the Hijrah, what is the supreme value in Hijrah? That he planned the event meticulously.
Strategic thinking.
Strategic thinking is the supreme value there. That's the essence of that particular event. Whether Hazrat Ali was in the thing or, this is all irrelevant. Step back and just think. Just sit back and say, you want to do this, how many logical and strategic steps do you have to take to fulfill that criteria? And you discover how much sophisticated kind of intellectual thought and strategic thinking goes into the Hijrah. Or during Hudaybiyah, when he is negotiating, right? And he says, let's start the contract with the name of God, and the Qur'an say, what God? If we believed in God, then we wouldn't be in that. It's okay, we leave that out. This is a contract between Muhammad, right? Messenger of God. Yeah. And they said, very logical for them to say, this is what we are fighting about. As far as we are concerned, you are not a messenger of God, right? We have our own gods, right? You are not a messenger of God. And Umar puts his hand on the sword, and as we read in various Sunnah's books, so and so people, half the swords are drawn, and the Prophet takes, and whoever is writing the scribe, he refuses to cross it out. He takes his pen and he crosses it out himself. That is the supreme moment of the Sunnah. Right? What happens is totally irrelevant. That moment where he says compromise becomes necessary for peace, that is a supreme moment. So the relevance of Sunnah in contemporary times is conceptual. It's not what he did and how he did it. It's that supreme moment where certain decisions are made. When he went to Medina and he created a constitution, he included everybody in the constitution. Their names and tribes are mentioned. Sabians, pagans, by the way, pagans are there, right? Christians, Jews, Ansars and Muhajirs, all of them. If Shias were there during that time, they will be there. If Ahmadis were there, they will be there as well, right? If Ahmadis, who we now persecute because they interpret their own way, and we say that they are not Muslims, and we burn their mosques, and we say they cannot call their mosque. Who we are to say that they cannot call their mosque, right? Who we are to say that our interpretation of Islam is superior to theirs, and we have right to burn them. That is the supreme moment, the Sunnah that we need to emulate, right? And unless we can do that, then the Prophet is not a model for us. Yeah, Prophet is only a model for us if we learn to forgive. If we say there is we've got to think strategically, and if we say there is a notion of equality and plurality that's deeply entrenched within Islam. This is Sunnah, not what he did. He went there. If you look at some classical texts, they're just full of battles. Actually, he only fought 2.5 battles. Badr, which lasted one morning, Uhud, which lasted one evening, Battle of Trenches, which did not take place, and 2 months in the Khyber thing. That is the entire. When you read certain Sunnahs, it looks like he spent all of his life fighting. No wonder the Orientals say Islam is violent, right? It's not the Orientals who invented this, it's our history that teaches us that. So we need to rethink our history, and we need to rethink what Sunnah really is, and what does it mean in contemporary times. And before we start demonizing, certain people for either their sexual orientation or their religious belief or whatever, we need to step back and think how big an injustice we are committing, right? And essentially, if Islam is not about justice, then what is it about? God doesn't need our worship. Everything worships Him, whether it likes it or not, as the Qur'an says.
If I may comment, in your introduction you mentioned something about people picking one particular verse, and you mentioned that because of the nature of the text, it's actually not possible to take one verse because you might find some other verse.
This is what I discovered. I started to follow the traditional road.
So I would say that the sister picked that particular verse, وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. If you read it in its complete context, it's actually about the incident. First of all, it is about the revelation, but about the incident of Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj, when the people, of course, it's a very argumentative chapter because they're saying, how can this ever happen? You're a liar, etc. And it's saying that no, whatever he's saying exactly what was revealed to him. In fact, later on in the same verse, like, how can you argue with him what he sees? He saw it with his own eyes. So I think there is this habit among us Muslims, unfortunately, where we pick one verse out of its context, and of course, even in mainstream Sunni Islam, not everything that the Prophet said is considered authoritative. Even the Prophet himself said that. The Prophet himself said, when I speak about matters of faith, you can take it from me. If it's not, then I'm another man. He's a smart man, but he can be. Even his own companions argued with him on a lot of issues, especially things like in the Battle of Uhud, for example, or Battle of Badr. Should we stand here? Should we stand there? He would consult his own people. Why would he consult people if he doesn't? If he doesn't.
It's supposed to be a model for us to consult each other, I guess. Unless Dr. Farooq has any other additional comments, I think we have come to the end.
For me?
One more question. Sure.
Right. Our Prophet Muhammad has been long gone, 1,400 years ago. Now we are already in the 21st century. We have 7.1 billion populations. From my study, I have discovered that 65 million from the 7.1 billion are displaced people. And the sad thing is that from the 65 millions, 90% are Muslims. We can all know about it. Now, moving forward, Prof, I may ask you, how do we go about in solving all these problems, this issue? And how do we go about? We have all these books, we have Qur'an and whatnot, we have all the Sunnah. But how do we go about in tackling all these issues, Prof?
You see, what we learn from the life of the Prophet is that refugees need to be respected. They need to be loved and embraced rather than rejected. See, I mean, if the Ansars had not accepted the Muhajirs, there'd be no Islam. That's where Medina begins. Medina begins with the acceptance of the Muhajirs, and they are Muhajirs by definition mean refugees, right? So Islam begins with refugees to a certain extent in that sense. So the basic principle that the Sharia teaches is looking after the refugees, embracing them in a sense. But an interesting point arises is that what are we talking about? We are talking about 200 Muhajirs going to a city like Medina, which has a population of, I don't know, not very much, literally tens of thousands. Right? So very small, and it's quite easy to embrace. But what if the reverse happened? Small city, large Muhajirs come, then what happens in that sense, in that dynamic? How much can you love and respect, and how much can you embrace? So we need to consider, there's a principle, but the concrete situation may then raise other questions. But also in contemporary world, 4 out of 5, as you said, refugees are Muslims. 4 out of 5. At this moment in history, I think probably this moment in history, it is unique in the kind of demonization of Islam that we have seen, probably have never existed in history. Right? It is not a good period to time to be a Muslim, because you are looked at with suspicion in almost every other country, right? In a sense. So we are in a very precarious moment in our history. Right? But also the situation is set to get worse and not better. Yeah? In the sense that at the moment most of the refugees in the Muslim are either political refugees, right, or maybe economic refugees. Mostly they're running away from war and persecution within their own country. Right? That's essentially all varieties of refugees come from that kind of that background. So you look at the Myanmar's question and all the Muslim refugees who came out, they come running from genocide, or Syrian or Iraqi refugees, or there's refugees from Somalia, and etc. But within the next 20 years, the Muslims are often described as a middle belt, the Muslim world. It's a middle belt because it covers the equator all the way down. So you see from Morocco to Indonesia, it's kind of covering that belt, right? And it is that belt where the worst effect of climate change will occur. So last year, the temperature in a city in Iran, do you remember the name of the city there? In Iran, in the Persian Gulf, was 55 degrees. Centigrade. 55. Last year. It is predicted within the next 15-20 years, this is going to be average temperature in that region, right? What will happen to people who are living in that area? So a new variety of refugee, the environmental refugee, is going to come out. So for example, you may have seen the photographs of the cabinet in Mauritius. There is a cabinet meeting going on, but the meeting is taking place under the ocean. Have you seen the photograph? Where they're sitting in the ocean and the cabinet meeting, because it's predicted that within 20-30 years, most of the Maldives will be covered in a sense. Where will the Maldives go? So the newer category of environmental refugees that is emerging, vast majority of them will also be Muslims. Yeah? Now, there are two things we can do. One is that we can sit back and say, Shias are kafirs, kill the Ahmadis, right? Christians are not allowed to use the word Allah, right? And etc. We can do that, which we have been doing very well. Thank you very much for the last 1400 years. We still haven't solved some basic issues, right? Or we can say this is a real Muslim problem, right? This is about to increase exponentially. Let us all come together. First of all, let us think what we can do about it. So the first thing maybe we can do, right, is to actually create a kind of technology that provides the refugees with their immediate needs. Right? Let's develop shelters that we can put up within a week. Right? Yeah. Let's conceptualize sewage systems that, because hygiene becomes a major problem in that we can dig up within hours. So if we have 1 million refugees coming, and we know they are coming in the next 2-3 weeks, we can have a city ready for them, which actually provides some sort of hospitality. Of course, we know we can do that because the technology is there, but some technology needs to be developed. A lot of technology is already there. And perhaps we should start thinking about it now. So instead of having yet another department of Usul of Fiqh, maybe we should have a University of Malaya should have a department of refugee studies, where they don't study refugees like they do in England, which is mainly about migration and what problems they're going to bring here. But they actually study in terms of how can we solve the problems of refugees on the ground when the problem arises, and then maybe long term, how do we actually turn them into a viable resource. So the Palestinian refugees are still refugees after 50 years. They are still refugees after 50 years. It's not, I'm not saying shame on Israel. Israel is the imperial powers. That's what imperial powers do. They exercise their political power and they oppress. That's what imperialism is all about, right? So there's no point saying that what about all the Arabs who still haven't, used that resource that existed there, intellectual and physical resource, and still treating them as refugees, still living in refugee camps. Shame on them, in that sense. So what I'm trying to say here is the refugee problem is just one problem. We are about to be hit with a whole string of problems, right? In the next 20-30 years. We have done a book called Muslims Futures, Trends, Emerging Issues and Scenarios. One of them is climate change and refugee. It's very discussed. IIIT is going to be publishing it in a few months. This shows all the new problems that the Muslim of the world are going to face in the next 20-30 years. It doesn't offer any solution. It's the idea is to raise awareness, all the trends and the emerging issues, and we have some scenarios. So an interesting scenario, for example, is that an AI bot is developed to teach Islam to children, right? And because it's machine learning AI that teaches itself as well, it very soon learns a great deal about Islam. So it requires all the traditional knowledge, it requires all the modern classical knowledge, because it's all available online. It then quickly realizes by reading this literature that ultimately what really matters is one interpretation of Islam, and therefore it then says, I am the most learned person. Right? Therefore my interpretation of Islam is the Islam. So it becomes the dominant thing. And like most mullahs, then he says, I do not accept any variation. Right? I am the ultimate authority. That's the scenario. But it's not all that far-fetched. Microsoft developed a bot called Tay. And the idea of that was that it will teach young people and interact with them. So within 24 hours, the bot became abusive. He started using filthy language and became racist, right? Within 24 hours. So they had to pull, they had to pull the bot out. Why did bot become like that? Because it learned from the young, that's what young people were teaching. They were using the language, he started using their language.
Replicate the environment.
Yeah, just replicated the environment. So a bot who acquires the knowledge of Islam will replicate the knowledge, replicate the environment that we have, and the historic environment that we've had, which has not been very, let's say, pluralistic and open. In most people, sometimes it has been, but sometimes it has not. Yeah. So it can acquire those tendencies. This is just one scenario. So essentially, I think we need. The final message is, whatever ethics and morality we derive from the Quran, we need to use that to solve the problems that we are going to be confronted with in the next 10, 15, 20 years, 30 years, because some of these problems will be very serious and they will have no parallels in history. Nothing in our history will tell us what to do about them, which requires us to start thinking about the future and take it seriously.
I guess on that note, we will close the event tonight. I would like to thank everybody for your participation, your questions, your comments, and thank you, Professor, so much for joining us this evening. It has been an honor.